Good evening. I'm delighted to be presenting at IBAM Chicago once again. Thank you very much to the Celtic Women International for this opportunity to speak at the Literary Salon. I think that it's really interesting that it is a salon because it is really like an at-home of the past. In these difficult and unusual times, I'm inviting you to an at-home here in my own home in Ireland, and I'm going to talk tonight about the story behind a book that I published in 2019 with Ireland House, and it's the story, the real events of a meeting in the Mansion House in 2017. And because we don't know the story of the events that happened at that particular meeting, I've written a play about it, but this is the real story of the Leaving the Ladies. So you'll see here on screen that I have the cover of the book Leaving the Ladies, which was published by Ireland House. And on the opposite side is the portrait that I used for the cover. The reason that I wanted to start the talk this evening to talk about revolutionary women and to talk about the cover, this is a pastel that's in the collection, the O'Brien collection, actually in the United States, and it was sold at auction in the last number of years. And Lily Williams is an artist that we know just a little about. Like so many of the women artists of this period, she was politicized. We can think of other artists like Kathleen Fox or Stella Solomons, who was a member of Common Amon, who were painting portraits of political activists. But this pastel at the first glance doesn't seem as if it's a political painting. You'll notice that she's wearing a flowing sort of costume, and it's draped in a particular way, and it is the tricolour that's used in as her costume. Now we know that the tricolour, although it had been presented to Ireland in the 19th century, wasn't really in use. We see it in the run-up to the Rising. Indeed, one of the Core sisters mentions that the first time that she had seen the tricolour was the tricolour pin that she had seen for sale at the O'Donovan Rossa funeral, and she was from Belfast. And so the use of the tricolour here is significant, and it is a political statement. And so it is this idea of the women who were in the revolutionary movement, who were active, and some of them sort of disappear from the record. So what we know about just Lily Williams, just to tell you a little bit more about her before I move on, she was from Ranelagh. She was the daughter of a druggist or a chemist or a pharmacist, and so she would have been comfortably well off, and she would have studied art, as many young women did, but she then made it her profession. So there's a mixture between landscapes and then some pencil sketches and pastel, as we see here, and oil paintings, and they come up on the market every so often. But we still have a lot to learn about her and her life story. But one of the stories that has come to light is that her home in Lower Beechwood Avenue in Ranelagh, when it was sold, they discovered behind a wardrobe a hidden room. And we do know that she did have people on the run during the campaign of independence, sheltering in her studio, but that also indicates that her home was also used for people on the run. So moving on from the artist who did the cover of the book, I want to talk a little bit more about the context of in the run-up to in 1917. So one of the things that the background is that a suffrage message and is being given out by a meeting that's a fictitious meeting that's happening, but it just sort of paints the picture of what it's like for women at this period of time. There was a decision that nationalist women would not fight for the vote in the same way, because it meant that it was going to be given by a foreign parliament. So there was quite a little bit of movement in women who were involved in the suffrage movement. Some of them became involved in the nationalist movement, most particularly Countess Markievicz. But there are others who sort of stayed to one side. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, who's most identified with the suffrage movement in Ireland, the founder of the Irish Women's Franchise League, who would, with her husband, produce the suffrage newspaper, The Irish Citizen. And she would have been very vocal about the rights for women from the earliest years, and would have been very involved with London suffrage movement as well. And they were pro a more militant type of campaigning. And this is a poster of the time. So like it was in so many other places, the argument was that if women were contributing with their taxes but couldn't contribute to legislation, there was a complete unfairness in relation to how women were being governed. And so in my story, I make the point that this suffrage meeting is going on at the time, and how the changes were huge for some women, because those who were particularly the non-militant suffragettes did not want to have any involvement that women who'd been involved in a rising up for independence. So some of the women who would have been involved in, as I said, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington here in the centre, and this is from the Museum of London, and it's a particular protest that took place in London, and there are Irish women who were involved in that. And you can see here also the figure here is most likely to be Patricia Hoey, who was a journalist who had been born in Dublin and lived her life at this particular period in London. And then she comes back to live in Ireland in around the 1916 Rising, and she takes place and takes part. Of course, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington wasn't taking part. She was a pacifist with her husband, but she still distributed food to all the different outposts at the time. But what's really interesting to note in terms of the plans for the Rising, there was a plan while war was ongoing, had the Rising continued, that they would have a civilian government in place, and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington was one of those who was selected to be part of that civilian government. And of course, she went on in later years to have an involvement in Sinn Féin. But when we're talking about the story, and we're talking about the moment, we're talking about the moment post-Rising. So this is the famous photograph that takes place at Eli O'Carroll's house when a feis was taking place, and it probably dates from the summer of 2017. Certainly, it's in a period where Kathleen Lynn is back from having been imprisoned. Now she was imprisoned in that she was held. She was a doctor, and it was really important that doctors were available, because obviously this is the period of the First World War. So she was held in house arrest in England while she worked for a doctor there. But she was released early from there to return home to nurse her sister. And then this is Madeline French, who you will also have heard of, I'm sure, who was responsible for setting up St. Ultan's Hospital with Dr. Kathleen Lynn in the aftermath of the flu epidemic in 1918. They established that in 1919. But this is, as I said, a group of women, and then this is Patricia Hoey, who I just spoke about earlier on, again having returned to Dublin. And it's these are the women. The work that we did for the government for the centenary in 2016. I did a complete survey of all the documentary records that reference women involved in the Rising. There were 77 of the women arrested, and so you'll often hear that number in relation to the numbers that came out in 1916. But my own research identified 300 women who were active during that period in time. So the story that I'm going to tell, and the story of the play, is the story of an actual event that took place in the Mansion House on the 11th of December 1917. Now, the Mansion House, for those of you who are familiar, you'll know that that is the Lord Mayor of Dublin's house, and that there was this reception area that's still there today, which is called the Round Room, which can hold several hundred people, and that is where they went on to have sessions of Dáil Éireann when they had the public sessions, and that was the official address actually of Dáil Éireann in care of the Mansion House. So on the 11th of December 1917, in the bathroom beside beside this room in the Mansion House, there was a meeting of a group of ladies. This was an organised and minuted meeting of the women delegates of the All-Ireland Conference, and it was attended by some of the most prominent women of the day. So we had Dr. Kathleen Lynn, Rosamond Jacob, Drusabella Barton, Mary Paroled, Alice Janelle, Margaret Lou Kennedy, and Constance de Markovich. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those to you now. So we know that, of course, that as the only woman sentenced to death, Constance Countess de Markovich had her prison sentence commuted, and she was convicted of life imprisonment. But within a year, change of government and a change of mood, she was released from prison in June of 1917. And this is a postcard that was issued at the time, and the absolutely huge numbers of people that came out to greet her when she returned. And because she came in from the boat in through Kingston, which we now know as Dún Laoghaire, she would have taken the train in as far as what we call now Pearse Street, but at the time was Westland Row, which is just alongside Trinity College, if someone knows the topography of the geography of Dublin City. And so and there was massive crowds, so she came back to jubilation and a real welcome. So in 1917, she was involved in a sort of a photo shoot, for the want of a better word. And these are photographs. This photograph is from that set. And she describes in the magazine article that she's actually wearing a Sinn Féin uniform. So of course she was a member of the Irish Citizen Army in the Rising. But when she becomes involved in the new changeover in government, the leaders of the Rising are executed, mass arrests happen, people are held in prison camps. So they were often referred to as the universities of revolution, because they brought moderate nationalists together with radical nationalists. And then when within a very short space of time those prisoners were released, they had decided that they were going to form under an umbrella of Sinn Féin. Now, it hadn't been a Sinn Féin rebellion. Sinn Féin was a political organisation that had been set up by Arthur Griffith, but the intelligence services didn't realise that there was a sort of a small group of people. So the military council was a small subset of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which had gone and infiltrated the Irish Volunteers and used the cover of the Irish Volunteers to call a rising. And you probably know there was chaos, because when the leader of the Irish Volunteers, Owen McNeill, discovered that they were planning an actual rebellion, he sent a countermanding order, so there wasn't the same turnout as there might have been. So this term Sinn Féin was a critical criticism, and it was a sort of the sort of common parlance in relation to it, this term, which translates loosely as ourselves alone. And so then this became the name of the grouping, the political grouping under which people gathered. This just as an aside there, this is the famous dog, Mr. Poppet, who followed the Countess everywhere. And when she was in prison in the Rising, she was minded by Mrs. Connolly, and then when other times she was taken by Drusabella Barton and brought out to Wicklow. So because, as I said, the Countess was imprisoned for long periods of time. Even after she was released, she was imprisoned again in 1918, and again during the Campaign of Independence. So this is just a coloured photograph of her. A number of artists did coloration of early photographs, and this was one I particularly liked, so I've included it in the slide presentation. So this League of Women Delegates, so what happened in relation to the formation of women? So we know that the women had been members of the Irish Citizen Army, and this is their flag. They were members of women from the Irish Women's Workers Union. There were members who were part of Coming On, which was the women's, just known as the Women's Council. It was the women who had come together. They were an independent body. They were attached to the Irish Volunteers. Their objective was to fundraise for a Defence of Ireland fund to raise money to arm the volunteers in the run-up to the Rising. It wasn't a huge organisation in the run-up to the Rising. It was really just building, and it had, you know, would run first aid classes and drill and other activities. And it was, as you can see there, its badge was a military badge. It's the initials of the organizations through a rifle, and they did have a uniform, not a set uniform. They had a description of what you could do, and a lot of women made their own uniforms, but it wasn't part of the fighting force in the way that you would expect. Some units did have military and target practice, but it was rare that women were part of the actual fighting force. So these are the organizations that grouped together as the League of Women Delegates. And what they needed to do was they needed to lobby Sinn Féin, because when Sinn Féin they were all the released prisoners, the released male prisoners. The person who sort of was first politicized in the aftermath of the 1916 Rising, that was the first organization that became this League of Women Delegates, or in Irish, Untitled Chapter, is the wife of Count Plunkett, Countess Plunkett, and Josephine Cranny was her maiden name, and she was the daughter of builders of a lot of what we would see as now Dublin 6. Those red brick buildings were her family. And so when she came together with the Plunkett family, who were also involved in the building trade, they brought a large number of properties and money from those rents. So they were a very well-to-do couple. Count Plunkett had been educated abroad. He had been, you know, he was multilingual. He was an expert in art history. He was actually an expert in Botticelli. He was the director of the National Museum when his son was involved in the rebellion in 1916. Indeed, all of his children, bar one, Moya, who was actually a nun, were arrested at various periods during that period in time. And this is Mimi, or Philomena, the eldest daughter. And then there was also Geraldine, who became Geraldine Dillon. There was two sons, Jack, and George. And then Joseph Mary Plunkett was the man that was executed in the Rising. That was their eldest son. And Fiona was also politically active in the period, and a major member of Coming On right through the period and into the Civil War. So Countess Plunkett, when the prisoners were released, Count Plunkett put together this idea of this amalgamation of all the societies, and his wife became a member of what was known as the Council of Nine. So she was the only woman member in any sort of role that would have been seen as involved in the administration or the organization of this coming together of all these Sinn Féin groups. Her husband had stood for election for Sinn Féin in North Roscommon, and so they were at the centre at this particular period in time of this changeover in politics, because of course so many of the leaders of the Rising had been central to activities, and now new people were stepping up to the fore. But of course this was going to be difficult for a lot of the women, because Countess Plunkett, and this was of course a Catholic, or the Vatican had given Count Plunkett the title of count. It was a papal count, because he had given money to set up a convent in Rome, and so he had been a papal count since the 1880s. So that's where his title came from. So the contrast really between the Countess Plunkett and Countess Markievicz was that the difference was that Countess Plunkett wasn't really seen by the other women as being having the roots in the politics, and even her own family. There's a book that was produced by Anna Burchan, who's one of the descendants of the family, and it's called All in the Blood, and it's really quite an unflattering portrait of the Countess. From the family records, they said that she couldn't be trusted, and so so it's in. So I'll let you read that, because this is obviously not a long involvement. And then so we have the Countess is returning, and then other women come to the fore to be involved in this organization. And one of those is Dr. Kathleen Lynn. When Countess Plunkett becomes ill, she gets nominated in the place in the Council of Nine. And so when the male members were coming back, of the 1,000 delegates, there was only 12 women representing all of these different organizations, and they became really, really uncomfortable with the idea that they would not have a role in the new regime with these new men. And Dr. Kathleen Lynn, who'd also been out in the Rising, she had been chief medical officer in the Rising, and you can see her here with her doctor's bag, and she's seen with Markovich actually at the steps of what's now the concert hall, but that was Eresford Terrace, which is where the treaty debates took place. So Dr. Lynn was very political at this stage, and one of the ideas behind the League of Women Delegates was that they believed that anything to do with women going forward should be based on the Proclamation of Independence, which addressed women equally. But they were forced into a situation with Sinn Féin to try and say that they wanted to nominate more women to stand in the election of 2018, to have a bigger involvement in the boroughs and public office across the country. And it was Tom Dillon, who was actually Geraldine Dillon's husband, who they wrote to actually distribute their letter to try and get the greater involvement. So the play suggests that the women were being cut out of a lot of the activity of this time, and it wasn't a given that women would have such a prominent role in the Free State nearly from the moment that the men returned from prison. And so the organization also included this lady, Alice Janelle, and you can see her here. So Alice Janelle was Alice King, and she was born in Mullingar in County Westmeath, and she was very active in politics, again in London. So she married Lawrence Janelle, who by this stage was standing to be a member of Parliament in England. He was an accountant by trade. He was a widower. He had lost his wife and baby, who died moments after birth, 20 years before this. And so when they married in 1902, I mean, there was a 32-year age gap between husband and wife, and she became to all of, involved in his electioneering. She actually said that in 1918 she became the first female election agent in Europe, in her own words, and she was very active in working with him, editing the work that he did, because he wrote books. And they lived a very nomadic life, actually. When you look at the census return for this couple, they're boarding with a mason and builder, even though he's a member of Parliament. He had a disagreement with the what was the United Irish Party, which is following on from the Irish Parliamentary Party, because he wanted to see their books. And so he's expelled from the party. Then he stood as a nationalist. He was known to be very vocal. He spoke out against what was happening in the aftermath of the 1916 Rising, and he was one of the first to declare for Sinn Féin. So he was one of the few people who was an MP that became a TD, following on through that period. And his wife was very much as his side. It's often said that she was a member of Cumann na mBan, but I don't really see the evidence for that. There is a military pension record for her, which suggests that she may have been a member of Cumann na mBan, but that may have been for pension purposes, because she had to claim that involvement. She's probably more likely to have been involved in the Irish Self-Determination League, which was an organization that was headed up by Art O'Brien, and that seems to be clear that the connection between them in terms of letters and exchanges. She did keep a diary, which is recorded under the Bureau of Military History, which records the activities of her and her husband. And she went on after this period in time to go with him to America, and also to South America, to Argentina and Peru, when he was actually out there promoting firstly the Sinn Féin underground government, and then later on when he was anti-treaty Republicans under De Valera. And you can see her here with the picture of the Countess as receiving the freedom of Kilkenny, which she received. And you can see that's W.T. Cosgrave. There's Eamon De Valera there, Father Flanagan, who was very involved, Darrell Figgis, and then this is Lawrence Janelle and his wife. And you can see the flanking here and the prominence that they're given in this. So for many, many years, I knew this photograph, but I didn't know the woman who was sitting in the front row alongside Markovich. And this is a later photograph of her and her husband. But I suppose what's really important is she was at that meeting, and she was very involved in this Untitled Chapter group, and they kept the minutes. And so it's a notebook that's in the National Library. It's mixed in with the Hannah Sheehy Skeffington papers. And so it was Margaret Ward, the brilliant historian, Dr. Margaret Ward, who wrote Unmanageable Revolutionaries back in the 1980s, who uncovered that when she was writing on Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and brought it to light. And it's such an interesting document that there were meetings in all the women's houses, but this one, as I said, took place in the bathroom of the Mansion House. And so wouldn't you like to have known what was going on there, to why they felt compelled to go into a female-only place to conduct that meeting? And then the other person who was at that meeting, as you can see here, is Dulcibella Barton, who was a first cousin of Erskine Childers, who's sitting in front of her in this particular photograph. Also in the photograph, the head down is Molly Childers, who was Molly Osgood of Boston, and it was her mother on the other side who moved to live with her in her latter years. And then behind Mrs. Osgood is Robert Barton, who was a member of the treaty delegation. He had been serving in the British Army along with his two brothers, and when he was actually posted to Dublin, and when he was posted to Dublin, he was given a desk job in terms of looking after people's personal effects, and it brought him straight in touch with the Union, with the new group of people, and he made this united sort of look at these new Sinn Féin leaders, and he and his sister set up Sinn Féin organisations on their estate in Anamo in County Wicklow, and also Lara in a nearby village. And so they were the two members of the family who became nationalists and very involved in that movement. And obviously later on, their first cousin. So he was a double first cousin. So Erskine Childers was living with his cousins, the Bartons, from the time he was about 12 or 13, when both of his parents died. So a brother and a sister. So so a Childers and a Barton then were sent back, and then Isabella's father became the guardian of the Childers family. And so of course it's from this house that he was on the run in when he was arrested and executed then in the Civil War. But Da, as she was known, is one of these characters that comes up through and referencing again in terms of her involvement in politics at this period of time. Very close friend of Markovich. She was also very close to the Boleyns, who were the J.P. Boland was in the Irish Parliamentary Party, and so you have the sort of the circles that are sort of a little bit different than we've seen previously. So a lot of the work that I would have done through the years would have been at the rank and file level of Common Amon and the Irish Citizen Army, and I would have looked very much at the ordinary sort of person who was involved in the not maybe at the leading level But in more recent times, for people maybe familiar with my work, I've been working on women in politics and looking at 100 years of women in politics and public life, and as part of the centenary program for the government. And what's been interesting about that is to look back at those people who were central to the politics of this period, who were involved in the suffrage demonstrations, who were coming from different backgrounds and different educations. So Isabella would have been she would have been educated privately at home along with her cousins. The girls were all educated at home, the boys were sent away to school. Erskine also had a sister with that family name, Dulcibella. And that's, so if those of you are familiar with the Riddle of the Sands, you'll know that that's the name of the boat that's in that particular story. So it was a family name. And then one of the other women who I've always adored, and I would really urge you to read her witness statement. You can also see her pension record online, but is Mary Paroled. She was Limerick born, had lived for a period in Cork, then came to Dublin, was working as I think she was working at one point as an accountant's assistant. She was looking for a job in the run-up to the Rising, and Connolly told her not to take one, that she'd be too busy, that there was a rising coming down the track. And this is a photograph that's in the military archives, which shows the Liberty Hall in the aftermath of destruction in 1916, around the time of this meeting in 1917. And the women that you can see here in the front are women who were involved in the Irish Citizen Army. So you have Winnie Carney, who stood for election. She was from Belfast. She didn't get her seat. This is Helena Maloney, who would be very familiar to many of you, who was really active in the labour movement and also a member of the Irish Citizen Army. And then this is Mary Paroled, and then you have Dr. Kathleen Lynn here in the foreground as well. And these girls are members of the not the Fianna, but the Clan na Gael Girl Scouts, and that were active at the time. So we've always been looking for images of people, you know, at different stages and different times, but Mary Paroled has been proved very difficult to find information on. She married late in life, didn't have any children, and she married a guy called Citizen Flanagan. And you know, her life is really interesting. I mean, she wasn't involved in the 1916 Rising. She was sent out as a courier to send the message that the Rising was going ahead, and hadn't got back to Dublin. But then when she saw the people being filed away to prison, she joined the group with the women and was talking to them, and then she was identified as a person of interest, and then she was arrested. And she was arrested for a longer time because she refused to sort of back down and not say that she was involved in activities, and she was held for a longer period of time. But what's interesting is that she was the registered owner of the Spark, so she was one of these people that was used. And we know that one other stage, because she was tall and thin, like the Countess, of course, in a time before, you know, people would be very familiar with what people would look like and identification the way we have it today. She was went to a meeting pretending to be Markovich. So she, we know in various accounts, was always, you know, involved, as she said herself, she was involved in everything. So she was involved in every organization, and, you know, she would, you know, say that was, you know, what she was doing at the time. Like, she was literally living as a revolutionary in the road to the Rising. And so it's not surprising that we find her in the midst of this organization. But the terribly frustrating thing about women's history in general across the world is the lack personal papers. And this is so true of women involved in this period of the campaign of independence and the Civil War, because of the fact that so many of them didn't marry and didn't have family. And so this is another lady that's really interesting, again, turns up at this meeting. So this is the first photograph that I was able to find of her, and it was in her military pension record, which was part of her obituary record, and somebody had clipped it to her file. And then I was able to go back and look at a photograph that I had always known that had been in Kilmainham Jail's collection. And this is the Countess with a woman who appears to be wearing a common amon military uniform. But as I said, they were told more or less what it was like, and then they used to have them made up themselves. So they didn't always tend to be identical to each other. Margaret Lou Kennedy was the youngest of 5 girls. She always worked in her home in Dromore Avenue, which is in the centre and close to South Circular Road. And her activities are considered to be home duties. And obviously there was an income from the boarders. And so she's one of these people again who doesn't marry, doesn't have children, doesn't have a personal papers, but we see her constantly through the whole of the pension record because she actually had to verify a lot of people's involvement, because of being officer commanding in Dublin City at this period of time. She later became a senator. She was very influential in how people were awarded their pensions and being able to vouch for people's involvement. So she's central to this organization. And she would have been one of the youngest women at that meeting, and she would have been in like her late 20s at that stage. So the fact that she was held in such high esteem among the organization at such a young age. So she was out in 1916 also. She was a member of the Marylebone Lane garrison. A very interesting character. And again, you can read her accounts online. And then the final lady that I'm going to look at is a woman who's born to Quaker parents who are lapsed, and her name was Rosamond Jacob. She is you can see the notebooks that are here. She kept a diary, and so you'll often see her quoted because we have her accounts throughout this period, and she's the observer while she's there. And Leanne Lane published her biography in 2010, and she called it third person singular, which is of course this idea that she's sort of talking in the third person as she records the events of her own time period. And again, this is where the wealth of having a piece of documentation is invaluable. And she was a member of all organizations. She was originally from Waterford, and that's where she was in 1916. And she was a member of the Gaelic League, had a Sinn Féin branch there along with her brother. She then comes to Dublin, and she was a writer. She wrote a first book in 1920 under the name F. Winthorpe. And she was very active in the period then in Cumann and in the Civil War, and was very involved in lots of different organizations. And I think again, because she has her own biography, again, you can sort of delve into her life story in a way that you can't with other people. But what I wanted to illustrate for this particular introduction to the sort of the play and Leaving the Ladies, which I really hope that Celtic Women will be able to put on and perform perhaps over Zoom in early 2021. I really just wanted people to get a sense of the fact that some of the women are well known and some of them are now sort of with you. Particularly, I know the Celtic Women International are such a well-read group in relation to the work that has been produced on this era. But I would hope that tonight has been something of a surprise for you in terms of people that were familiar or not so familiar, and that they've come to light. I suppose what I really wanted people to take away from this particular talk is that it's revolutionary in all its terms, is politically revolutionary. There's militants and there's non-combatants, and there's organizations which obviously go beyond the scope of this talk, but the women who were involved in the White Cross, the idea of the involvement in another area that I'm working on at the moment, the idea of the American Commission, and so many influential and important political women in America were involved in putting their voices and giving their names to the establishment of a commission to find out what was happening in Ireland in the campaign of independence. And it's those organizations, it's the interconnections, it's the letters that are not extant anymore that may tell us of interconnections between these people. But when people shared an involvement and an interest in politics and how women were going to contribute in terms of the running of administrations and ultimately in the running of government, I think what's very important to remember that those women too were in Ireland at this time, and they it's just a new way to look at it, and we've got such a wonderful wealth of new resource material available to us with the pension record coming online. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you one day in Chicago once again. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.